Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Discriminating Gamer. You know, I've got to tell you, I've got a lot of passions other than just board games. For instance, I like to collect a lot of old magazines. I have a lot of issues. Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to go ahead and take a look at Fire in the Sky from Phalanx. Fire in the Sky from Phalanx, two players take on the roles of either the American forces and the other allies, or the Japanese Empire in their quest to dominate the Pacific. The game board is a map of the Pacific Ocean. You've of course got the West Coast, you've got Japan, you've got Asia all the way to India, and the various islands. The Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and of course Australia and New Zealand, as well as many, many more. Now you have different kinds of unit counters. For instance, you have air power, which are six-sided counters. You have ground forces, which are circular, and then you of course have your naval units, which are squares. Each of these units has various ratings. For instance, your Navy will have anti-aircraft rating, kind of a bombardment rating, and various other stats as well. You'll also kind of have your movement point allowance and exactly how many points you've got to spend in order to move that unit. Now this game boasts several scenarios. You can play a complete campaign game from the Japanese attack of Pearl Harbor all the way to the Japanese surrender. You can play from Pearl Harbor to Midway, to Guadalcanal. Now critically along the game board you're also going to have a track that details things like your oil reserves, your transportation point allowance, victory points, and various other information. You're going to be constantly using that and monitoring that track as you proceed to go to war in the Pacific. Now, there are, I think, about 10 steps during each round. This is one of those games where you may not get in a lot of turns, but each turn has a lot to it. I'm not going to break down in detail what each of these phases do, but I'm just going to give you a general overview of how the game is played. First of all, you have a kind of an economic phase. In this economic phase, the Japanese player, for instance, can do different things. They can go ahead and critically they can move oil from resource areas to the Japanese home islands. That gives them kind of more points with which to move units later in the game. The Americans will also be able to conduct some submarine warfare and attempt to knock down Japan's resources. Next, you have the reinforcement phase. You've actually got reinforcements that are going to come off the board that come in at certain times that kind of fit the historical narrative of the war. When you hit a certain time frame along the time track, the turn track, then you get to bring those forces into the war and place them in your home bases. Typically, Japanese units are going to come in from Japan. United States units will come in from the West Coast. I think there's ways to do it from Pearl Harbor. And the British also have options to bring people in from India. Next, you have the first deployment phase. This is kind of where you're positioning your units to attack, and you go ahead and you actually spend your transportation points during this phase. You spend transportation points to be able to actually move your units from certain areas of the board to other areas of the board in preparations for attacks. Now, you may have to stop if you move into certain areas that your enemy has a zone of control, like their air forces exert a zone of control. You have to stop in those regions. Next, you got the operational movement phase. This is where you're moving to attack. During this phase, land units, for instance, you have to essentially double their movement capacity. You're spending double the points to move them because they're moving under combat conditions. And air units as well must spend essentially double their transport points at this time. Next, you have a reaction phase. In certain circumstances, the non-phasing player can go ahead and activate some of their units to attempt to intercept or block the units from the enemy that are moving. Next, you have kind of a combat phase. So if you've got your units in a position to fight, you can go ahead and transfer to the battle board. There is a submarine segment where you can attempt to actually take out the enemy's ships using submarines. This is a very brief segment. Then you go to the main battle phase, which is, there's a lot to it. The first thing you're going to do is the air combat step. Essentially, you're going to calculate all of your air power points. You're going to then fight other fighters in the air, other air power in the air, and then you're going to select, with whatever you have left over, you're going to select ground targets or naval targets you're going to go after. Now, during that air-to-air segment, you're going to try to get air superiority or air supremacy. That is going to give you certain advantages going forward. Now, next, if you're attacking ships, there's going to be some anti-aircraft that you're going to have to take, but then you can go ahead and target those ships. Next, you have surface combat. Your ships are actually going to fight against each other. Now, certain factors are going to be die roll modifiers, like if you have supremacy or superiority. Generally, you want to roll on a 6-sided die, you want to roll 5s or 6s, usually are hits. You want to roll those high numbers, and again, there can be certain modifications and modifiers that make it easier or more difficult to hit a target. Next, you're going to kind of repeat this process with the naval battle. You're going to go ahead and fire on each other. You're going to attempt to knock each other down using kind of ship-to-ship combat. Again, you're trying to hit those high numbers. There are also options to withdraw if you need to sustain another round of enemy fire, but you can attempt to pull back. Typically, units like ships are going to take several hits to take, and you're going to keep track with the number of hits with certain markers you can use, and then once so many hits are taken, that ship is destroyed. Next, you're going to move your naval units into the appropriate places. Now, if you're doing an amphibious attack or if you've got land units involved nearby, you're going to go ahead and move to the land unit phase. You're going to repeat this process for the land battle and then determine control over who is left. Next, you're going to have a return to base phase. Essentially, those units that move during the operational phase are going to be able to return to their bases. And you're going to have a second minor deployment phase where, again, you can kind of move units around in order to set them up more strategically to withstand the enemy's turn. Finally, you're going to have the end phase where you just kind of clean up and do some housekeeping with everything you have on the board. But players are going to go back and forth. They're going to be moving their units. They're going to be initiating attacks. They're going to be watching those tracks of their transportation points or oil. Japanese can also spend oil to help with transportation costs. And you're also trying to accrue victory points. Now, the victory point track is kind of a tug of war. It's going back and forth between two numbers, and typically, all things being equal, if the Japanese victory point ever reaches 40 or more, then they win the game immediately. If the victory point track ever reaches 19 or less, then the Allies win immediately. Now, if no one has achieved victory by the end of turn 16, if the victory point tracker is on the 20, it is a draw. But if it's over that, then it is considered a Japanese victory. So players are trying to move that victory point tracker to wherever they want it to be, and whoever has succeeded in achieving their objectives wins. Fire in the Sky. So Fire in the Sky is a kind of one of these big, epic Pacific War games. And I don't think I appreciated the complexity of this game. This is a fairly complex game. It's not so complex that you can't learn it, and it's not so complex that it is indecipherable, as some war games can be. There is a pretty steep learning curve. Once you get your head around the basics, it kind of comes together, but still there's a lot of exceptions and special rules and little things going on here and there. This is certainly a step up from, say, an Axis and Allies or something like that, obviously. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot going on here. And really, I just scratched the surface of the rules. I would not just buy this game based off of my rules breakdown. I'd look up the rules online myself, or I'd check out kind of a more exhaustive rules breakdown, because there's a lot going on here that I really didn't get into. The game is interesting. It's a good puzzle, and it provides, okay, how do I want to... It's not only a question of how do I want to move to, attack and to maximize my offensive here, but what can I afford to do? You're always watching your transportation markers. You're always watching those transportation tracks, particularly if you are, you're bringing those like land units and air units, and you've got to double how much you're spending. You got to be very careful, because you can't do all you want to do every turn, and you can't bring in every unit you want to bring in every turn. So it forces you to make tough decisions that way, and really analyze not just an attack for the short-term benefits, but every turn you got to look at the big picture, because you got to keep your eye on your transportation. Now, generally, the United States, their transportation points are going to go up every turn, and the Japanese are going to go down, but the Japanese do have the oil to kind of offset that. So that's pretty interesting. Now, there is an optional rule I do recommend playing with if you play this game, and that is the hidden task force. The Japanese kind of have a pretty big advantage at the beginning of the game, and it's kind of a way to maybe offset that a little bit, where the United States has various task forces, and you can essentially screen them. So the Japanese player knows a task force generally where it is, but they don't know what it consists of until they actually go do battle with it. So that's kind of an interesting way. It's a little hidden information. I keep thinking somebody needs to make a game like this, and this would work for, I think, a lot of war games, but I think particularly a Grand Epic Pacific game would be so much fun if you had a game that was the Pacific, but you could actually have an app, and you would input your movements into the app. So neither side knows where their units are until they actually come within sight of each other, or there's some other triggering mechanism, in which case you can learn about where their units are. That, to me, I think would really be kind of one of the ultimate fog of war system. And we can do it with the technology with apps. So that's, if you're a game designer, look into that. The Fire in the Sky it's a good game. It's a fun game, it's an interesting game, it's a tough game. Now, having said this, I don't know that I'm going to come back to it, because it's a little more complex than I like. There's a little, it's one of those games where there are a lot of little things that get you. The devil's in the details. And while the rulebook isn't bad, it's not as helpful and user-friendly as I would have hoped it was. Very often there are little things that you think, oh, this makes sense, this is good, and then you go, oh, wait, no, I need to look up something kind of relevant to it, and then you actually go to find where that is, and it's not where you expect it to be. That's a little disappointing. I can't think of examples off the top of my head. I just remember when we were playing it, and I've only played this once, so spoiler alert. It was work going through and finding a lot of the rules, and it's not a game you're just going to sit down, read the rules one night, and then boom, you're ready to play. That's what I tried to do, and there's a lot of stuff that keeps coming up. If you don't mind the complexity, if you're somebody that likes that and you like to take your time with a game and really get to know it, I could see you really enjoying this game. I could see you really liking it. Me, I kind of wish, this is a re-release, obviously. It had come out years ago. I kind of wished it had been a little streamlined, and I don't know, I've never played the original. Maybe it is. But I kind of wish there was a little bit of streamlining here. It was like Phalanx recently came out with the Successors, which is a fun game. I really enjoyed it. But it could have used some streamlining. I think there's a point where, when there are too many exceptions and little rules for the sake of historical accuracy, it does the game a disservice. I would much rather have a good, fun, playable, workable game that gets the game right than one that tries to fit all the little historical bits at the sacrifice of just fun and straightforward gameplay. I realize I'm maybe in the minority in that. I know a lot of people, when they war game, that's their engagement with history, and that's their engagement with these wars, and so they really eat that stuff up. I get that. I'm not one of them. I'd much rather play a fun game that invokes the history, that is representative of the history, rather than is just meticulously tied to it. Anyway, my point is, I'm going to say try it before you buy it, for Fire in the Sky. There's a learning curve. There's some complexity here that may turn off some people, but again, if that's your thing, I really think you'll eat this game up. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us today on The Discriminating Gamer. As always, we ask you to please leave a comment for us on YouTube, on Board Game Geek, on our Facebook page, or on thediscriminatinggamer.com. We'd ask you to please like us on Facebook, subscribe to us on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter. I'd ask you to please check out my other channel, that is Cody Carlson, PhD, where we talk about military history and fun things like that. And I'd also ask you to please subscribe to that channel as well. And subscribe to this one if you haven't done that yet. Give us a thumb on Board Game Geek for this video, too. We also really appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take just a moment, speaking of World War II and the Empire of Japan, to recognize the man who invented the zero. Thanks for nothing. Please somebody help me on my feet again, and I don't know where I'm going, and I don't know where I've been. Please somebody help me on the solid ground. It's a long time, and I'll be dying. Once a year I wind up in the band. God knows that I... Ah!
Dang it.